lots of writers write in the super early morning. And there is something about like the period between about 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. where it's like the door to the subconscious is still a little bit open. And it's possible to do work of a quality in those hours. It is virtually impossible to do at any other time. And so this is why you see even, people like Ernest Hemingway, who was, this was an incredibly active guy, deep sea fisherman, could drink with the best of them. But every morning he got up and he was at his desk by 6 a.m, no matter how late he'd been up the night before. And having that routine was, he thought, really essential for doing great work. And to judge by his output and that of lots of other great writers and scientists and mathematicians and other people, he was absolutely right. So routines serve as a foundation for and support for creativity rather than, an obstacle to it, as we often tend to believe.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Artists of Data Science podcast, the only self-development podcast for data scientists. You're going to learn from and be inspired by the people, ideas, and conversations that'll encourage creativity and innovation in yourself so that you can do the same for others. I also host open office hours. You can register to attend by going to bit.ly/ADSOH. I look forward to seeing you all there. Let's ride this beat out into another awesome episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a 5-star review. Our guest today is a futurist who studies people, technologies, and the worlds they make. With an academic training in history and sociology of science, he blends history, anthropology, and sociology, plus ethnography, interviews, historical case studies, and literary analysis to understand users and their worlds. For the past 2 decades, he's worked as a technology forecaster and futurist, helping companies understand new technologies and global trends and their strategic and business implications. He's the founder of Strategy and Rest, a consulting company in Silicon Valley and a visiting academic at Stanford University. He's also an author, having written books such as Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less, The Distraction Addiction, and has written for Slate, Wired, Atlantic Monthly, and Scientific American. So please help me in welcoming our guest today, author of Shorter, Work Better, Smarter, and Less, Dr. Alex Pang. Dr. Pang, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be here today. I really, really appreciate having you here.
Oh, thanks very much. It's great to be with you.
So if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Pang, can you talk to us a bit about your journey? How'd you get to where you are today? What were some of the struggles you faced along the way, and how did you overcome them?
Okay. First off, I think that this interest in the role of rest in creative lives and the way that organizations can play a role in sort of helping support that in sort of their employees is one that actually has really deep root, right? I studied history of science as an undergraduate, and the first class I took in that field was called Invention and Discovery in the Arts and Sciences. So it was about kind of the psychology of creativity. And so it kind of set up the questions that I've been trying to answer in my last 3 books. And then I think that I really started to recognize the value of rest, both as sort of something to cultivate in one's own life, but also kind of subject to investigate and to write about when, I started paying the price for not getting enough of it. I've worked as a technology forecaster, as a futurist for almost 20 years now. And about halfway through that, I started reaching the point where I was, sort of constantly on projects. I was traveling a lot, and I was starting to feel myself burning out, and had a chance to take a step back to spend some time at Microsoft Microsoft Research Cambridge as a visiting fellow. And while I was there doing the research that became my book, The Distraction Addiction, about technology and distraction and focus, I also realized that while I was there about halfway through, that I was getting all kinds of stuff done. I was reading a lot. I was having these great ideas, but I didn't feel like time pressured and overwhelmed the way that you always do here in Silicon Valley. That's just like, part of the air. And it started me thinking that, the assumption that we've all kind of inculcated here, all absorbed here, which is that overwork and burnout are essentially like the price of doing good work, and that you have to perpetually be always behind, and you're kind of locked in this race between succeeding before you exhaust yourself. That maybe that approach actually is completely backward, and that we actually can achieve more for a longer period and do deeper work if we recognize the power of rest. And that, that experience stayed with me, eventually became the subject of my book, Rest, where I had kind of investigated the neuroscience and the psychology that explained how it is that sort of rest turns out to be a really important ingredient in creative lives, how it sparks imaginative thinking, and sort of how it helps us not only be more creative, but more creative for more of our lives. And then Shorter, is about how organizations can take the lessons of rest and put them into practice, mainly by moving to things like 4-day work weeks or 6-hour days. So kind of taking, what often is this kind of privileged way of working that is accessible to people who have a lot of control over their time or are already really successful and can kind of dictate the terms of their work, and kind of democratizing it and turning it into something that is not just good for people, but is also good for organizations, is good for families, and ultimately is good for the economy and society. So that's the answer to how I got into all this and kind of where I've gone with it.
I'm really excited to be getting into some of the topics that you cover in your books. But before we get to that, as somebody who is a futurist and a technology forecaster, where do you see technology headed in the next 2 to 5 years?
I think that the outlines of the major things that we're all going to be dealing with are fairly clear, right? We're going to see sort of continued developments in things like artificial intelligence and Internet of Things, sort of a kind of expansion of sort of robotics and automation into all kinds of new areas. So, I think they kind of represented at home by different sorts of smart objects. I think we're also seeing some really interesting stuff starting to emerge with stuff like, autonomous and driverless vehicles, which are not so much about like autonomous vehicles that carry people, but I think the really interesting stuff is starting to happen around stuff like freight carriage, right? Sort of around sort of automated delivery of small things, whether it is moving blood supplies around in hospitals in East Africa by drone, which is something that's already happening, to automated robotic delivery of sort of pizza packages to your home. So these are all trends that we're seeing already that are playing out and are continuing to do so. I think that the other thing that we're going to be, another thing that is clearly going to become more important are technologies around kind of public health and public safety. I think that coronavirus has revealed the degree to which we have accidentally designed a world that is as friendly to viruses as it is to humans. If you look at something like the open office, for example, right? Sort of the long table, the common spaces, all that, lots of glass and stainless steel. Viruses turn out to love that. That's an environment that they can thrive in. With that recirculated air, common spaces that everyone's handling, conference rooms, collaborative centers. And so architects, urban designers, they're going to have to figure out how to use things like automation, remote work, robotics, et cetera, to redesign and reconstruct working spaces so that they are safer places to be. And I think connecting to Shorter, one of the things that I've been really interested in the last couple of months is how we can redesign time, how we can redesign workday to meet those challenges as well. But I think that when you are looking at technology trends, it's often not the case that there is some completely weird thing that futurists know about that nobody else does. Very often the sort of broad picture is something that we all can see. The challenge is figuring out how it's going to play out in different industries or different parts of the world, thinking about how we can control control and shape those technologies and their uses so that they give us, more flexibility, more autonomy, more freedom, as opposed to just, eliminating our jobs or doing other bad things. So that's where I think all this stuff is going.
So in this vision of the future that you have, what do you think will be some of the biggest concerns that society will be facing?
So I think that public health has risen to public consciousness in a way that it doesn't usually, except for things like, events like Ebola or SARS. If you travel to Asia, you go through airports, you go through public spaces, you had already seen changes in accessibility and transit and so forth that were a response to SARS in 2013. I think we're going to see the same kinds of things here in the States as well. So, a really simple example is a dramatic increase in the use of, infrared cameras and things to do temperature checks for people as they go in and out of buildings or other kinds of spaces to guard against people coming in who, have fevers. I think that questions around sort of how to automate different kinds of industrial functions or transportation or so on are going to get even more urgent at a time when it looks like we're going to have to do some economic rebuilding. We are probably going to go into a recession and stay there for a while. And as we fight our way out of it, one option to increase productivity is to automate all kinds of stuff and just throw a lot of people out of work, but, sort of create an economy in which Wall Street and the owners of the robot do even better. It's also possible to use those same technologies, though, to empower workers, to augment their abilities, to help them do work that is more valuable and more meaningful. And it is not cast in stone which way we deploy these technologies. And so I think that, that particularly in a time where we're probably going to be facing some substantial economic challenges, that's going to become another big thing that we're all going to be talking about. The third thing that I think that, I would flag is issues around technology and kind of equity and social justice, right? There were academics who for years have been talking about how algorithms, how, sort of predictive policing systems, facial recognition systems, how these unintentionally encode racial biases and presumptions about, who is deserving of suspicion or who is a potential criminal, quote unquote. And I think that we're at a point where it's really clear that these are things that we need to address because they have very big implications and negative impacts on a lot of us. I think that will be another big area in which we have to figure out how to make technology better and how to make it work better for us.
So speaking of how to make technology work better for us, what can we do now and perhaps going into the future to mitigate our distraction from technology?
Right. I think that there are a couple big things to flag. I think the first is that we live in a world that is designed to distract us. And indeed that, and we interact on a daily basis with products like Facebook, Twitter, etc., that are not only designed to distract us, but make money doing so, right? They have armies of behavioral scientists who figure out how they can boost engagement just a little bit. Right? So we face, I think, bigger challenges than, any generation has in technology-driven distraction. That said, I think it's also the case that, as humans, we not only have a capacity to sort of be diverted by these, shiny, blinky, cool things, but we also have great capacities to focus, to concentrate, to place our, to consciously direct our attention. And I think that, even as we recognize that these technologies are trying to kind of tear that down, we always have the ability to make choices and to build that up and to build it back up. What that requires essentially is practice. It is about recognizing the ways in which these technologies are designed to capture and to commodify our attention, recognizing what's at stake, how much better our lives can be when we retain the capacity to focus, and sort of being mindful about how we use technologies so that we can the more focused, more concentrated versions of ourselves we want, rather than have our consciousness be at pushed and pulled by devices and by service providers. So I think it's one of the kind of encouraging things I've seen with the companies I've been looking at, the ones that move to 4-day weeks, is that they actually attack the distraction problem head on. Right? Distraction is actually a pretty big problem in the workplace. There are studies that show that between, technology distractions, between people coming over and asking, that one quick question that turns into a 10-minute conversation, between meetings and other things, people actually lose between 2 and 4 hours of productive work time every day. So if you can get a handle on that stuff in the workplace, right? If you can make meetings shorter, you can be more mindful about how you use technology, you can go a long way to actually decreasing the amount of time that you spend at work without affecting your productivity at all. And you can learn things in the workplace about how to get a handle on this problem that you can then use in the rest of your life, or everywhere else in your life. So
thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's very interesting. And yeah, I think I've suffered from that attention residue quite often, switching between tasks and, getting an instant message to pulls your focus away. But I would love to get into your book, Rest.
Sure.
Let's start at the top here. Like, what is rest and what's the problem with it?
So the problem with rest these days is we don't take it seriously enough and we don't get enough of it. I think that in addition to living in a world that's trying to, constantly distract us, we also tend to work in places that assume that we ought to overwork. Right? That overwork is actually kind of a badge of honor, that there's a sort of moral value to it, and that people who are successful work titanically long hours, right? I think our vision of success is of people like, say, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, right? People who are multi-billionaires before they're 30, who work incredibly long periods, who motivate other people to do so, and as opposed to the old vision of what kind of success looked like, which was you work your way up the ladder, you wait your turn, and then finally, late in your career, you reach the C-suite or, you become CEO. These days, it happens very fast or not at all. And so one casualty of that is a recognition of the value that rest plays in both restoring our capacity to do good work and restoring our capacity to be creative, to do innovative things. However, there has been a huge amount of work done in neuroscience and psychology and organizational behavior in management that shows just how costly overwork is, both for individuals and for organizations, that shows how beneficial, regular breaks, be they, regular shifts, be they vacations, sabbaticals, what have you, can be both for people and for companies. And I think body of work, including my book, that explains the particular pattern that super creative and productive people develop or kind of discover that allow them to do really good work while working far fewer hours than most of us think are necessary to do, to do world-class work. I think that this is, we live in a world that doesn't take work seriously, but we also live in a world that provides us with all the tools necessary to figure out how to harness rest and bring it back in our lives and use it as something that makes our lives better and makes our work better.
Yeah, it's kind of reminds me of like a symptom of the hustle culture, right? Mm-hmm. where it's glorified to work
exactly.
so many hours.
Right. And I think that there is, it is not to say that there is not plenty of value and potential reward in, in working hard, right? Or in concentrating and focusing deeply on things, on really significant problems. I think the problem comes when we treat the long hours kind of as an end in themselves, and when we as individuals or as managers assume that there's a correlation between long hours and overwork and productivity and accomplishment. The lines between those two things are not as well drawn as we think. And it's also the case that we know very well that overwork has really clear downside, right? That people who work long hours for a long period, or organizations that do the same thing, are more prone to burnout, to, big mistakes, to running into issues that actually make them less productive than they would be working 40 hours. And so I think that, recognizing that after a certain period, that overwork is actually deeply destructive and counterproductive is something that, that lots of us kind of recognize in principle, but are challenged to actually put into practice. And so I think that one of the things that both Rest and Shorter do are make the case for that, and especially in Shorter, explain how we can redesign our time, redesign our work, so that we avoid all of the problems of overwork while getting the benefits of, focus and rational hard work and high productivity.
Anders Ericsson has this concept of deliberate practice. You've got this concept of deliberate rest, which I found to be fascinating. Can you just describe what deliberate rest is and how can we incorporate that into our lives?
Sure. So the idea of deliberate rest actually also comes out of that Anders Ericsson study of violinists and sort of how they practice. What Ericsson found was, I think, as lots of people who've read either his work or Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours rule essay found that, top performers practice regularly. It takes roughly 10,000 hours or so to become really good at something. But but also they practice differently than just kind of ordinary performers. They tend to be more focused in what they're practicing. They get more feedback. It's a more targeted thing that is aimed at specific improvements in performance as opposed to, trying one more time to do the same thing that you already know how to do. One of the other things, though, that Ericsson found was that not only did the top performers practice differently, they also rested differently. They actually slept more than average performers, about an hour more per day, because they took naps in the afternoon. And while they did not spend as much time in doing leisure activities, they were better able to account for their time and to explain their hobbies. And that made me realize that not only were these people practicing deliberately, they also were resting deliberately. So more broadly, the idea of deliberate rest is that it is possible to incorporate periods of rest, hobbies, and what I call into sort of your daily routine and into your life in ways that both increase your capacity for work, that help you become more creative, and also just help you have a better life. So that's what the idea of deliberate rest is.
So a lot of folks in data science space, we do a ton of studying, research, knowledge discovery, a lot of knowledge work and intellectual work, very different from the work that, a violinist does or an athlete does. So why is it that rest is important for those of us who don't use our bodies or tactile kind of appendages, but use our brains?
Well, first of all, I would say that most cognitive work is actually more physical than we realize, both in the sense that when you talk to philosophers of mind, one of the things you learn is that there is a kind of physicality to cognition that we engage constantly, but we tend not to think about. So the philosopher Alvin Noe, who is, I think, at New York University now, has a book about action and perception, where he talks about vision and perception being very active thing, right? It's not, our eyes aren't like cameras that simply absorb information. When we look at stuff, we're actually interacting with the world, interacting with our subjects a lot more than we realize. More broadly, I think there's a physical dimension to cognition that means that it is embodied and sort of makes demands on our bodies that bring it somewhat closer to, to sports or to manual labor than we might realize. The other thing is that, while we tend not to think of it this way, but the work of doing stuff like talking to people, being on Zoom calls, this actually is kind of cognitively and physically draining. Even though if you compare it to like the real work of like doing construction or being an electrician or something like that, it never really quite feels like work. And I have certainly spent my life thinking, compared to what my uncles do, that, this is not real work. But in fact, there is irreducible physical component to cognitive to cognitive labor. And so what that means is that, our capacity to do that kind of work is actually enhanced by developing our physical abilities, developing our stamina, and that sort of the more that we do that, the better we are able to do the hard work of, creative thinking and deep thinking that I think that so many of us strive to do. So that's why we should pay attention to that. That's why we should think of cognitive work more as a kind of embodied physical thing than we normally do.
So is this physical aspect of cognition, is this the default mode network of the brain that you talk about?
Yeah, the default mode network is connected to that partly. I think the default mode network is mainly something that neuroscientists study and have been kind of fascinated with over the last 20 or so years. Really briefly, the default mode network is the set of brain patterns that activate when we kind of relax our attention. We don't think about anything at all. We kind of zone out. And it feels like when we do that our brains are kind of slowing down, but in fact, they're not. It's just they switch into a kind of different gear. And what's fascinating about that is that the parts of the brain that kind of link up together and get active when we don't think about anything at all are the same parts that are associated with creative thinking, with sort of visual thinking. And what we suspect is that this is the kind of physical mechanism that explains things like spontaneous memory or a spontaneous discovery. We've all had that experience where you're trying to remember something like, who is the actor who was in that movie and that TV show and that other thing. You can't remember who they are, but 5 minutes later, you're doing something else. And all of a sudden, their name pops into your head. That's the default mode network continuing to work on problems even while our attention has moved somewhere else. And it seems that the same network operating kind of at a deeper, more profound level is also the same thing that's at work when Einstein comes up with a special theory of relativity, or Picasso comes up with the idea of painting from multiple perspectives simultaneously. It's the same basic physical mechanism that operating at the level of the kind of everyday memory, the everyday aha moment to the most profound one. So that's the default mode network at work.
And I think this is something data scientists could all relate to, because we've all had those moments where we're working on a really big, gnarly problem, and then we step away for a while, maybe go home, like you said, wash the dishes, take a shower, and then it just comes to us. That's the default mode network at work. Awesome.
Absolutely. And that's something we often think of that as something that's like totally mysterious, but it's actually something that, it's not something that you can control, but it is something that you can learn to harness better. And one of the great lessons that I learned in the course of writing Rest was that, a lot of really great scientists and artists and writers kind of craft their day, partly to give themselves time to rest, but to rest in ways that give their default mode networks, their kind of subconscious, their creative subconscious, plenty of time to work on problems that they haven't solved, right? And so the great example of this is people who will construct routines, daily routines, where they work really, really hard on problems for 3 or 4 hours, right? Don't answer the phone, no interruptions, no nothing. And then almost immediately after that, they go for a run or go work in the garden or do something else that is physical, it's different, but it's not very cognitively demanding. And in that period, your subconscious, your default mode network continues working on the problems that have just occupied your conscious attention. It gives your sort of creative subconscious time to work on these without your kind of conscious intervention, and to explore possibilities, to explore solutions that have eluded your own, focused effort. That's the phenomena that we have when, you're blocked on a problem and, you go for a walk and you come back to it and, 2 minutes later, you've got the answer, right? Because your default mode network has been working on it that whole time. Well, it turns out you can build a whole routine around that to help you be more creative, to help you be more focused, to solve problems faster, and to get back the energy that you actually spend in those really super focused periods, so that you can, work better, you don't burn out, and you still do really cool work.
What's up, artists? I would love to hear from you. Feel free to send me an email to theartistsofdatascience@gmail.com. Let me know what you love about the show. Let me know what you don't love about the show. And let me know what you would like to see in the future. I absolutely would love to hear from you. I've also got open office hours that I will be hosting, and you can register by going to bit.ly/ADSOH. I look forward to hearing from you all, and I look forward to seeing you in the office hours. Let's get back to the episode. So how can we convince our boss that all we need is a solid 4 hours?
Right. I would start with the data, right? I mean, the studies of the sort of cognitive cost of multitasking, of meetings, of interruptions that find, that those 2 to 4 hours every day get lost. I think also that, we all recognize how much more we can get done in 2 or 4 really focused hours than in like 8 or 10 distracted ones. And finally, that this is not just an individual problem. It's not just a challenge of like self-discipline, right? We often think of these kinds of psychological or cognitive things as just issues between like, our brains and our eyes and our keyboards. But in fact, there is an important social dimension to attention, to cognition, and to creativity. And, if you do things like set aside particular times of day in the workplace where you don't have to answer the phone, where you have permission to be heads down and a little antisocial, you can actually get an enormous amount done. And I don't think there should not be a manager anywhere who is against the idea of, people being able to focus and get stuff done, because fundamentally that's what offices are supposed to do, despite the fact that they're often designed, to do exactly the opposite.
So what are some horrible ways that people are resting, and we should probably stop resting in that way? And how can we replace those with better ways of rest?
I would phrase it not so much in terms of horrible ways that people are resting, but in terms of like misconception. And so, I think that we often think of rest as totally passive and leisurely, right? It involves sitting on the couch with a remote in one hand and like a bag of salty snacks in the other. But it turns out that the most restorative, most creatively stimulating kinds of rest are actually a lot more physical and active. Things like, exercise, long walks, working in the garden. Kind of physical activity is often more restorative, and it is also, it's psychologically engaging, but not so engaging as to prevent us from being able to mind wander and to kind of explore ideas even while we're, out on the running path or hiking trail. Another aspect of I think rest that we overlook is that rest is actually a skill. Rest is something that we can get better at. It's a bit like, like breathing, right? Breathing is completely natural. It's something we do without thinking about. But if you're an athlete or if you're a singer, you can use, you learn to pay attention to your breath so that you can run faster or you can, project to the back of the auditorium. Rest is the same way. I think that we can learn ways of incorporating it into our daily schedules. We can learn to pay attention to those kinds of leisure activities or hobbies that turn out to be more restful than others, and that provide us with a greater amount of, detachment and kind of creative and psychological renewal. So I think those are the things that, I think we need to recognize about rest and how to do it better. Now, I think that for people who are like really intensively focused on their work, people who really like their work, the challenge for them is very often to find something that is as engaging as their work, right? Winston Churchill talks about this in a book called Painting as a Pastime, where he says that for politicians, for people who are accustomed to action, that you can't just tell them to do nothing. You have to give them an alternative to their regular work. For him, it was painting. And I think that, people who are super successful and super busy, who have engaging hobbies, find ones that are as cognitively challenging as their regular work, but in a very different kind of area. So lots of executives and lots of scientists, for example, are rock climbers or mountain climbers. And for them, climbing is either like, it's sort of like management or it's like science. For scientists, it's like science in the sense that you're engaging with the natural world. You are taking a big problem and you're having to break it down in a whole bunch of little parts. There is a technical aspect to it, but of course it's far more physically engaging than anything you do in the laboratory. And it's also, it gets you out into the world. And at the end of the day, you've either reached the top of your climb or you haven't. So the satisfactions, the rewards come very quickly. And so it's everything that they like about doing science without the frustrations and in a very compressed time scale. I find when I talk to people about about their hobbies and what they like about them, they all report the same thing, which is that there's this important cognitive dimension to it that so it's kind of like the best parts of their jobs. At the same time, it's in a very different kind of context and the rewards come far more quickly. The final thing is that there's often some very personal dimension to it. It's something that's almost kind of autobiographical. So, people might be into restoring cars because they come from a family that, was was into cars. They grew up around them. Or likewise, people who were into, scuba diving or model making because they had close friends who did that. Or it connects them back to some family tradition or some earlier part of their life. And so all of those things together serve to turn these hobbies into things that are sort of super engaging, that can actually compete with their day jobs and can provide, another outlet that reminds them of what they like best about their work, so that when things are really challenging, you have the resilience to push through and, and to continue against the odds to do good work.
Really interesting. I think that speaks to one of the reasons why I like golf so much, is because it reminds me of the gradient descent algorithm in a sense. So you've touched on this a little bit, in our conversation. I want to dig a little bit deeper. So how does having a daily routine help us be more creative? How does that help us be more productive?
So, well, it depends partly on the daily routine, right? Sort of, if you do a lot of self-destructive things, you're not going to be as creative. But sort of a good routine builds in time for focused work and for rest, number one. And why that's important is that our creative minds seem to do better when, with these routines. Stephen King has this line about how, the muse will descend if it knows that you're working. And we have this idea that, there's this kind of romantic idea of creativity that holds that you get an inspiration and you kind of rush to the keyboard or the blackboard, and 18 hours later you come out with a concerto or finished theorem or whatever. In reality, most creative work operate in the opposite way, right? You start work, you get into a problem, and then once you're really into it, that's when kind of the muse appears and sort of the serious advances, the breakthroughs start to happen. And so, so creative work, very rarely is a game of gigantic leaps and bounds punctuated by long periods of doing nothing at all. Most sustainable creative work is actually proceeds much more reliably and much better if it's embedded in a set of routines that support it well. I think the other thing is that humans, we have daily rhythms, right? And one of the really valuable things we can do is learn to pay attention to those so that we match up the times when we are at our most potentially creative to the times in our schedules where we're doing the most heads down, super focused work. This is one reason that lots of writers write in the super early morning. And there is something about like the period between about 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. where it's like the door to the subconscious is still a little bit open. And it's possible to do work of a quality in those hours that is virtually impossible to do at any other time. And so this is why you see even, people like Ernest Hemingway, who was, this was an incredibly active guy, deep sea fisherman, could drink with the best of them. But every morning he got up and he was at his desk by 6 a.m, no matter how late he'd been up the night before. And having that routine was, he thought, really essential for doing great work. And to judge by his output and that of lots of other great writers and scientists and mathematicians and other people, he was absolutely right. So routines serve as a foundation for and support for creativity rather than, an obstacle to it, as we often tend to believe.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I've done some research and reading on routines and creativity myself. And ever since I started to implement a very strict regiment into my daily schedule, I found that my creative output and productivity has gone through the roof. Granted, now my routine has kind of been thrown for a loop because of this whole COVID situation and a newborn baby upstairs. Yeah. But have you by any chance read Robin Sharma's book, The 5 a.m. Club?
No, I haven't. No, it sounds like something I should check out though.
Yeah, definitely. He's got this concept of the 20-20-20 formula where, you're up by 5 a.m. and 20 minutes you work out, 20 minutes you meditate, 20 minutes you read, and, have that structure in place and then go about your day. And it's like he says something similar to what you just said, how those early hours in the morning, there's a special magic to that time. So yeah, I'm down here in my basement every morning by like 4:30 a.m., 5 a.m. It like you said, it sounds counterproductive, right? Like it's like, oh man, like it seems like it's an obstacle to being creative, but really the obstacle is the way. Like the way to creativity is by having structure and rigor in place. Thank you for that. So let's jump into your book shorter.
Sure.
So you talk a lot about design thinking in the book. I think the whole framework of the book is pretty much based on design thinking. Do you mind quickly touching on what design thinking is and maybe walk us through that framework?
Sure. Well, design thinking is, it's a kind of way of sort of thinking about and solving problems that developed in Silicon Valley here in like the 1960s and 1970s. And in contrast to, let's say, industrial design or, more conventional kinds of product design, I think the hallmarks of design thinking are, number one, that it involves a lot more attention to users throughout the process. You try to engage with them earlier, listen to them. You also, and this connects to the second thing, kind of sort of offer them the opportunity to like play around with prototypes very early on, see what they do with them, and then you kind of iterate and improve the product based upon what you see. You give them another, version 2.0, they play with that. You see, you get feedback from that, and then you do another release and on and on. I mean, in a way, a lot of software product development is a sort of build on design thinking, in the sense that there is this naturally iterative, quality driven largely by user feedback. Right? And then, so there were a couple, and in shorter, one of the reasons that I talk about design thinking or use it as a framework for structuring the book is that a number of the companies I look at are design firms, are software firms that are led by people with design backgrounds. And so when they were talking about the journey that their companies went on, they kind of naturally fell into the design thinking framework as a way of sort of explaining what it was that they were doing and what stages they went through. And so the most important parts of it were the sort of iterative phase or ideational phase of looking at how your company and how your time is organized right now, working through what you imagine would be necessary to make a 4-day week work instead of 5 days, thinking through the different scenarios of what could go wrong, how you deal with it, and engaging everybody in the company in that exercise. And then doing a lot of prototyping where you allow people to experiment with different ways of holding meetings, of using technology, automating processes, thinking about what parts of their job they can outsource, what stuff they can automate, and what things require, really like dedicated focused time, and then testing that, sharing the results of these different little experiments so that they become best practices across the company. So for example, there's a software and design firm in Copenhagen called IIH Nordic, where they have run something like 300 different experiments on everything from, the kinds of snacks that they have in the kitchen, high carb, high sugar versus high protein, and trying to measure the effects that different snacks have on people's productivity, to experiments with using technology in meetings, to using outsourcing certain functions to assistants in the Philippines or automated scripts. And these are things that individuals will try for a while and then collect some data on, share the results with everybody. Sometimes really successful things get adopted widely by everyone. Sometimes they get discarded, and if they're discarded, then the experiment doesn't work out, then you try something else. But I think that spirit of continuous iteration of of kind of brainstorming, prototyping, testing, and then going back and improving is the key thing that you see in these companies over and over again. It's a key thing that you see in how people talk about their work, that they take a very experimental kind of approach to it. It's a very sort of Carol Dweck, it's a very kind of growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset, right? One in which you can learn from your failures. You're not afraid to try new things and to experiment and to see sort of what doesn't work in order to get a better handle on what does. So, and then I think that the other important thing about the design thinking approach is that we tend not to think about time as something that we can design, right? Most successful design projects are, object or services, right? So, the Apple mouse or, the Palm Pilot. But it turns out that it's possible to design our days, to design meetings, to design processes using very much these same tools. And we can do so with the same kind of prototyping, experiment, test mindset. And we can get improvements that are, in how we spend our time that are just as significant as improvements in the products or the services that we use. So that's the long answer to, why hang the design thinking, all of this around the kind of design thinking frame.
How can this framework then help us work better, smarter, and less?
So I think that I have looked at more than 100 companies now across a variety of industries that have moved to from 5-day weeks, or more, to 4-day weeks, to 6-hour days, 30-hour weeks, or even 25 hours. And what I'm seeing them do is, and like I said, they all take this kind of iterative experimental approach, one that often is pretty data driven, but they all do a fairly common set of things, right? Just focusing on the knowledge workplaces rather than, the nursing homes or garages or factories. The first thing is they make meetings a lot shorter. They go, standing meetings almost all disappear, and other meetings go from a default of an hour to a default of like 15 or 20 minutes. They also tend to get smaller and they're more focused, right? No meeting occurs without an agenda, and you have the minimum number of people necessary in the room to make a decision or to get an update as absolutely necessary. Another thing that they will all do is they think a lot about how to design the day to have those, to build in and to protect those periods of really defocused work. And then the other thing is that they all learn to use technology in more productive ways. So what that means is outsourcing less valuable, more routine kinds of tasks and figuring out how to use technology to augment their highest value added, sort of most creative kinds of work. So a really simple example is a company called Farnell Clark, which is an accountancy in the UK. They were an early pioneer in cloud-based accounting, which is, using cloud-based accounting software that is shared both by the accounting company, but also by clients. What this allows is for easier input of, basic financial data, but it also makes things like tax reporting, tax filing much simpler, right? That's no longer a thing that takes weeks and weeks of time, but can be done in days, which frees accountants up from doing a lot of routine stuff, kind of routine filing, to being able to do stuff like looking at bigger patterns in spending, investment, talking to clients about, doing more kind of advisory service stuff, which is stuff that is more interesting to them, but also more valuable to clients. So, that's one example of how how a company has used technology to simultaneously reduce the amount of time that they spend working, but increase the value of the work that they do. And this is something that plays out in, different ways in different companies, but all of them are looking for those opportunities to outsource or automate the less important stuff while augmenting their ability to do the really creative stuff. The final important thing that they do is that they do all this stuff together rather than individually. As I said before, there's, we often think of, productivity and creativity as like these individual psychological things, but they have this really important social dimension to them. And the companies that do this best, that are most successful at shortening their working hours without sacrificing productivity or profitability or creativity, are ones that see that attention is social, that creativity is social, and that by solving problems of things like distraction for everybody, you get results that are far, far superior than the ones that come from sort of me just trying to maximize my own utility or you just trying to maximize yours. So that's the stuff that I see, or the particular things that I see companies doing. And, they're trying a variety of ways to do that, going through, ideation and prototyping and testing in order to make all that stuff happen.
So what would you say is the biggest difference in terms of leadership mindset, leadership mentality between companies that are innovative, taking on these shorter work weeks, and, companies that switch to maybe a pseudo shorter work week in the form of a 4-day, 10-hour work week?
Right. I think probably the single biggest difference is that they think differently about time and the relationship between like time and productivity. They do not see working longer hours as a sign that things are going well, but rather they see overworking working long hours as sort of pathologies. They're indicators that something is broken in the company that needs to be fixed. I think that, another important thing is that they also think differently about their people, right? All of them are trying to create more sustainable places to work where people could have very long careers. In contrast to the way that many of their competitors work, which is to bring in a lot of young people, work them to death, and then discard them after several years. I think that the idea that reigns in these companies is that you may be doing something very, very different 10 years from now, but you will be here in 10 years and you will be able, and you will be a lot better at what you do now. Part of that improvement in quality will be that you can actually do the work in less time, right? As one founder put it, one of the things I realized is that anybody can sit in a chair for 12 hours a day. You give anybody enough time to solve a problem and they can solve it. The person who really impresses me now is the person who doesn't need, 12 hours to solve a problem, but can do it in 6 and be out of here. That's the person that's the person I want to hire. And so I think that, that what happens with these people is that they essentially rewire the relationship between time and expertise and productivity and come to see overwork not as a good thing, but a good thing to be encouraged, but a bad thing that they want to sort of redesign out of existence. So that's how they differ.
Yes, it's almost like maybe 50, 60 years ago when you're working in a factory, there might have been a linear relationship between the amount of hours you work and the output you produce. But as we're shifting into this knowledge economy, there's no longer that kind of linear relationship between time in, productivity out, right?
Right, yeah. And indeed, sort of the relationship between time spent and output, even in factories, was not as ironclad as we think, right? Basically, people could work in factories, could work overtime for periods of a few weeks, and then you start getting tired, you start making mistakes, you start to burn out, and your productivity would fall to below what it was when you were working 40 hours. This was discovered in things like optical factories and munitions factories, right? Places where small mistakes really, really matter. And what we've known for more than a century is that you can sustain periods of like 70-hour weeks for about maybe 4 to 6 weeks or so. You can get a burst. But after that, you're back to where you were, same productivity levels as when you were working 40 hours with, the added benefit of people, getting sick and burning out. So, but I think that it's even more true today. Basically, intensive periods of focused work beat periods of, long semi-distracted work. Knowledge work is a little bit more like high intensity interval training than, like running a marathon, it turns out. That intensivity turns out to be a better route to higher performance and better results than the long grind.
So I know some companies, they opt to do flexible time instead of shorter hours. Mm-hmm. And that's not really the same, is it?
No, it's not. And traditionally, flexible hours have had some organizational challenges around them. I think a lot of people, there's sociologists who've looked at this talk about the flexibility stigma, and which is that first of all, in organizations where long hours are a badge of honor, flexible work inherently looks kind of suspicious. It's also problematic because when you're working flexibly or when you're working from home, the person who is doing so often has a kind of subtle obligation to do extra work in order to stay visible to their managers, to stay in contact with colleagues or project heads. And so they end up actually working as much or more as they would when they were just in the office. At the same time, they also encounter the kind of enduring suspicion of, why is this person, not around when the rest of the team is, here every night after dinner? And so So in many organizations, flexible work turns out to be challenging for everybody in ways that nobody intends. It'll be interesting to see in the future, after all of us have, after so many of us have had experience with working from home with flexible work, whether the stigma around flexible work starts to ease or not. I certainly hope it does, but it is very different from shortening work weeks for everyone, because when you shorten work weeks for everyone, there is no stigma around people working less. Now, everybody gets to do it. Everybody shares the challenge. Everybody shares the benefits. And so it makes it a very different kind of proposition than when it's just one person or a couple people doing it.
Thank you for that. So last formal question before we jump into a quick lightning round here. And
Sure.
That's, what's the one thing you want people to learn from your story?
So, I think that the single biggest thing is, I would say, take rest seriously, right? That, rest is not something that you get when you've finished your work. It's not something that the world gives you. These days, we're never finished, and the world always has one more thing to throw at you. So we have to carve out time for rest. We have to defend that time, and we have to take rest itself seriously. We have to recognize that this actually does have value, both in the immediate run and in the long run, for us, for our employers, for our families, for the world. If there's one thing that I could convince, that everybody of, it would be that.
All right, so let's jump into a quick lightning round here.
All right.
What is your favorite way to rest?
Yeah, I go on walks with my dogs. I've got two of them, and it's my favorite way and it's their favorite way.
So if you could put up a billboard anywhere in the world, what would it say and why?
I suppose it would be, take rest seriously, for the reasons I just outlined.
So what's something you believe that other people think is crazy?
A year ago, I would have said that believing in the possibility of the 4-day week was the thing. I think there's still a lot of skepticism around it, but fortunately, people are taking it more seriously. They're at least more willing to hear the argument for it. So, but there's still plenty of people who think it's crazy. So, I will stick with that. That the 4-day week is possible right now, and your company can do it at virtually no cost to you, with benefits both for you and your and the organization and your bottom line and your clients and your employees. It's a win-win all around.
So you've done a lot of great research in your books for neuroscience, kind of understanding the nature of the human mind. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the most bizarre aspect or quality of the human mind that you've come across?
I think the default mode network is the strangest and most wonderful thing. The fact that, we think, see these functional areas switching on in the time it takes us to blink. I mean, literally, that's how fast they turn on, is really incredible. And more broadly, it's a reminder that there is an incredible amount of stuff going on in our brains that we are not really aware of. We have this vision of ourselves as conscious agents, fully engaged in the world, and that is just, it really is just not the case. There is so much else happening even within our own minds that, that we're not in control of, sometimes in very good kinds of ways, that make our lives a lot more interesting than we could ever imagine.
So what's an academic topic outside of data science that you think every data scientist should spend a little bit of time researching up on?
I think everybody should spend some time looking at the psychology of creativity. This stuff is both really, really interesting, but if you want to get better at whatever your job is, it's worth spending some time, it's worth getting into.
What's the number one book you'd recommend our audience read and your most impactful takeaway from it?
Obviously, other than my own books, I would nominate Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It is a life-changing book. And as an explanation of a mental state that I think every every smart person, experiences and probably wants to experience more of, and as an explanation of why this is so rewarding and why it makes our lives great. It is, I think, without peer.
It's a great book. There's Mindset, Flow, plus Smarter, Better, Faster by Charles Duhigg. I read those 3 books in succession, and my life has never been the same since then.
Yeah, they're all great.
So if you could somehow get a magic telephone that allowed you to contact 20-year-old Alex, what would you tell him?
Probably buy Apple. I think that the challenge with advising your younger self is that a lot of the really important things we learn the hard way. I think we have to make some kinds of mistakes in order to become the people that we are. I suppose actually the really serious thing I would advise is have kids earlier. I think that there is almost nothing that you do before you become a parent that is as significant or as life-changing as what comes after. And also the more energy you have, the better, because children are wonderful in many ways, but they're also vampires, and they will suck up every ounce of time and attention and energy that you have. And so, that's the other good reason for having them early rather than later.
As a 37-year-old brand new father myself, I wish I would have told myself that.
Yeah.
So what does creativity have to do with being a good scientist?
Well, I think let's turn it around and say, how good a scientist can you be if you're not creative, right? The serious answer is that creativity is implicated in every part of science, whether you are going after, sort of gigantic world-changing problems or whether you are solving really little ones. An awful lot more of our lives involve creativity and creative problem solving than we acknowledge. And I think that likewise, there are many kinds of work that we don't think of as involving creativity, whether it is, bagging groceries or installing plumbing or wiring up a house, that actually involve a lot of sort of solving tons of little problems and solving them in ways that allow us to get a little bit better at doing them the next time, or that require a degree of imagination and kind of conceptual leaping that's not visible from the outside, but which is still essential for doing that work. So that's, so I would say that you want to be creative because it's something that you're going to be using every single day and every single hour of your work.
So what song do you have on repeat right now?
I have been listening constantly to the new Bruce Hornsby album, Absolute Zero. Hornsby was he was probably most popular in the late 80s for songs like Mandolin Rain and The Way It Is, kind of, which now are sort of easy listening-y sorts of piano-dominated songs. And the thing is, there are lots of people who, once they reach the kind of stage in their career as Hornsby, are just like, they're playing the same stuff over and over again. Hornsby, in contrast, in this new album, is working with experimental musicians, with Bon Iver, with like this avant-garde string quartet, and he's taking his old, you can still hear distinctive elements of the Hornsby sound, but they're like deconstructed and broken up in really amazingly interesting ways. And for me, for someone who grew up not only with Hornsby's music, but grew up in basically the same neighborhood as him, to hear this stuff processed in this wildly new, novel way is both interesting really personally, and a great reminder that you can continue exploring things, deepening your skills, but pushing into new areas, no matter what stage you are in your career. So Absolute Zero.
Definitely have to check that out. So what's the best advice you've ever received?
Best advice I've ever received, from my mentor, maybe be yourself, only more so. So, which is how he advised me to sort of approach interviews. So, the other great piece of advice is write every day. I think going back to that idea of creativity being something that is supported and sustained by routine, I think that practicing every day is the way that we get really good at just about anything.
So where can people find your books?
Rest and Shorter and Distraction Addiction are everywhere books can be found. Your local bookstore, Amazon, the library, if you, all those places. So that's
So how can people connect with you and where can they find you online?
Sure. So I am on Twitter and Instagram at AskPang, AskPang. The Instagram is mainly pictures of the dogs, but, and then company website is strategy.rest. So rest became a top level domain a couple years ago, very happily for me. So strategy.rest. And it's also where, not only is there stuff about workshops and keynotes and, links to interviews or podcasts like these, but also samplings of the research that I'm continuing to do, looking at companies, schools, other kinds of organizations, governments that are moving to 4-day weeks or, other kinds of shorter work weeks.
Dr. Pang, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be on the show today. I really, really appreciate having you here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great time.